It's 1998 and everybody's wondering what's the year 2000 is going to bring. But for the next few minutes, we're going to go back in history, the history of Butler, Missouri. Now, I've been collecting memorabilia for Butler and the surrounding area for nearly 30 years, and I've accumulated a lot of things, and I think it's time to share them with the people who are interested. You, the readers of the News Express that tell me you like my article each week. Now, I'll be showing you pictures and articles that come from the good old days. We're going back to about 1852, 56, somewhere in there, and we're going to go about 70 years up toward the 1920s. So I hope you'll sit back and enjoy this video. Hello, I'm Eddie Herrman. This is a picture of General Orlando Butler, for who Butler was named. He was from Carnation, Kentucky, and he was a hero of the War of 1812. Butler was originally platted in 1852 with the courthouse square to the east abutting Lyon Street and slightly to the north. In 1856, the county seat of Bates County was moved from Papenville to Butler. There it remained until General Ewing's infamous Order Number 11, which depopulated Cass and Bates counties. Union Army reports and history accounts all say that Butler was completely burned to the ground. And by the way, the aluminum sign shown here was purchased in the early 1930s by a Butler car dealer, and as far as we know, there are only 3 known to yet exist of the over 100 originally sold. This earliest known photograph of Butler is dated 1868. It features the Great Western Hotel, Pyle and Wilson's drugstore, which had just moved from the west side of the square, and J.W. Hanna's hardware store. This was noticed as being on Main Street at the Fort Scott Street Road. Records say that Dakota Street was originally the Fort Scott Road. In 1869, the north side of the square of Butler seemed to be flourishing. Sandwiched between the 2 tall dry goods and grocery stores was Henry Hartwell's real estate office. Also in 1869, the new brick courthouse was nearly finished. Note the 4 workmen on the roof at the tower. I understand that at the Cornerstone Lane, a crane slipped, allowing a steel bar to hit a lady spectator who was seriously injured. When it was completed, the courthouse was a fine improvement over the frame quarters that the county government had been using on the northeast corner of the square. During this period, newspapers began crowding into the booming prairie towns. O.D. Austin, pictured on the right, not only published the Bates County Record, but also became a Butler postmaster. Now, at that time, the post office was north of the square on Main Street. Well, this was common for the editors of newspapers because they were very political, and many of them taking part in local governments. In 1872, A.L. Lindsay operated his stagecoach line serving Lacine, Kansas, and Papenville, with stops in between, from the Pickett Hotel, which is at the south end of the west side of the square. This was an advertising flyer by a dentist named I. Osborne, who evidently was on the west side of the square. His methods probably were very crude by today's standards. In 1862, Captain Irvin Wally and his Union men bushwhacked Cole Younger's father between Kansas City and Harrisonville, killing him. After the Civil War, Wally built this house at 200 South Main as an inn. In the 1870s, when Younger began riding with the James Boys, the gang came to Butler searching for Wally. History says he hid in a well and escaped being killed. This house is still standing. This is an invitation to a calico dress ball in the courthouse of Butler, Missouri. Now, back in 1873, when this happened, the courthouse was the hub of all activities. It was the only place that had a large enough room, the courtroom, to have things like this. And this was for Thursday evening, December the 25th, 1873. And this was printed on actual calico cloth. That was the invitation that came through the mail. Tickets were $1. By 1875, the Butler Square was booming, and for reasons unknown to us, the north side was always the most popularly photographed. The post office is the one-story building, second from the right. Being the county seat, Butler aspired to higher learning, so the Butler Academy was built on, of all places, College Street in 1876. It was first owned by the Presbyterian Board, but soon ceased operations and later was torn down. Also in 1876, a fellow from St. Louis, Missouri by the name of Samuel Levy opened a dry goods store in the Atchison building on the east side of the square. Mr. Levy, besides being a good merchant, was also involved in civic affairs. In fact, in 1888, the governor of Missouri appointed Mr. Levy to fill the unexpired term of Associate Judge Boswell, who died after being struck by lightning. January the 2nd, 1878, Bates County's temperature plunged to 40 degrees below zero, a record that still stands. The east half of the north side of the square burned to the ground, mainly because of the lack of water, very cold weather, and the equipment which is pictured. Water and equipment were inadequate even in good weather. After the big fire, the city fathers decreed that all new buildings on or adjacent to the square would have to be constructed of brick and or stone. With this edict, 3 brick kilns were opened to meet the demand. One of these was on the bank of the lake southeast of town, shown in the background of this photograph. Down through the years, this lake has been known as Welton Lake, Mooney Lake, Kennedy Lake, and the Kansas City Fishing Club Lake. You'll note an island with a well on it. This became quite a health spa because of the mineral water of the well. Various individuals around town would cut ice in the cold winters and store it in insulated barns, covering the ice with sawdust. Pictured on the lake southeast of town is one of those ice houses. Note the inclined slide where the ice cut from the lake was maneuvered up and into the building, and they never cut the ice unless it was at least 6 inches thick. Some cut ice in the mountain branch to the east and to the south of Butler, and it may not be prudent, but I'm going to mention that, well, where does the city's sewage runoff go? With the advent of an easy supply of brick, not only was the burned out north side rebuilt, but the east side also refurbished. This view from the courthouse cupola looks east. Building number 1 on the left was the Bennett Wheeler hardware store. Number 2 is Samuel Levy and Company. And number 3 is Elliott Piles drugstore. And by the way, Dr. Piles' residence was on the northwest corner of the square, where years later the Inn Hotel would be built. And the building with the arrow pointing to it was the old Christian church. As the population grew in Butler, the need for grain mills also grew. M.S. Powers became the first one in 1886 on the South Main Street Road. It later became the Bar Mill and the Butler Mills. Fay's Diamond Mill in Delaware and Hinton's Mill on Lion Streets were both north of Indiana Street, which was later renamed Mill Street. Wyatt and Boyd also had a lumber planing mill near the depot when the railroad finally came through Butler in 1880. In 1880, a fire started in a restaurant to the south of Samuel Levy's clothing store and burned out the north half of the east side of the square. Levy's, M.S. Cowles, the Democrat newspaper, and others were displaced. Levy's and the Democrat went to the north side of the square. M.S. Cowles moved to the booming Rich Hill, the newspaper stayed on the north side, and Levy's eventually moved back to the east side. On the night of December 6, 1881, something happened in Butler that only a very few persons had ever seen. 4 direct current arc lights atop the courthouse lit up the area for 20 miles, if we are to believe the newspapers at that time, and there's also reports of being able to read a newspaper 2 blocks away from the courthouse. Captain Flavius J. Tigard, Butler banker and a promoter, had seen the light, so to speak, on a trip back east, and he helped organize the Brush Electric Company. The plant was originally located on Pine and Lion Streets. In the late 1870s, William E. Walton came to Butler from Sedalia, where he had invented the Walton copyrighted abstracting system, which simplified a long, tedious task in land transactions. He married Cora Allen of Nevada, a very talented musician and soloist. He formed the Bates County Savings Bank with a Mr. Dutcher, but the bank failed in a short time. The Waltons were very society-minded, and they decided Butler needed a refined place for plays and musicals. They bought the block on the southwest corner of the Butler Square and sought the finest craftsmen throughout the Midwest. This photograph you're viewing shows Mr. Walton's new banking venture, the Butler National Bank, in the northeast corner of his building on the main floor. Also were various offices above, and to the right of the bank was a furniture store and undertaker. On the east side, a print shop and the entrance to the Opera House. It was to be the finest west of St. Louis, and in December of 1882, the grand opening of the Walton Opera House took place. Special trains of dignitaries of other cities were met by the Butler Cornet Band and escorted to the Opera House by the band. At 8 p.m., the 800 people attending crowded into Butler's shining light. They heard speeches by Butler officials and other dignitaries. Mr. Walton was presented a gold-headed ebony cane inscribed with his name and the occasion. And recently this was donated to the Museum of Pioneer History here in Butler by Shirley and myself. After the speaking, the 3-act comedy Engaged was presented by the May Wheeler Troupe, then feasting and dancing until 6 a.m. the next morning. In the late 1880s, the Waltons sold their Opera House building to the Bonham Brothers theatrical family of Kansas City. On January 1st of 1889, Mr. Walton moved his Butler National Bank to his newly constructed building on the west end of the north side of the Butler Square. A newly organized bank, the Farmers Bank, moved into the vacancy in the Opera House building. One early morning in February of 1889, the Butler night watchman saw smoke coming out of the roof of the Opera House building. The fire had been burning a long time, and when it got air, the building was lost. Mr. Walton added the Walton Trust Company to his Butler National Bank, and he and his wife continued to be the epitome of society as they built a mansion on the northwest corner of Pine and Delaware Streets, later selling to the Baptist congregation for their church. When the east side of Butler was rebuilt, Samuel Levy rebuilt also. This building still stands, and they have expanded to the south and to the north. In 1887, Butler was visited by the notorious saloon smasher and bar buster Carrie Nation of Butler, Missouri. She and her followers paraded around the square of Butler on a snowy day, and she had many imitators, one being Maggie Greathouse of Rockville, Missouri. James H. Morgan came to Butler in the late 1870s and advanced from livery stable man to city night watchman to city marshal. On one occasion in 1882, Marshal Morgan was investigating a call that someone was riding a horse and firing a gun in some of Butler's finest stores, which, not only being against the law, but sometimes was just downright messy. That someone happened to be Captain John L. Stanley. When sober, he was a gentleman and a fine attorney, but when he tasted the devil's nectar, he was uncontrollable. Marshal Morgan proceeded to arrest him, but the captain persuaded the judge to let him go home and sleep it off, and he'd return to the court the next day. Well, the next day he was again on his liquid diet, and he seeked out the marshal and shot at him, narrowly missing. Well, the marshal's aim was better, and Stanley died 4 days later after completely exonerating the marshal. Captain Stanley's best friend was livery stable owner and saloon keeper J.W. Willis. His hatred for Morgan grew, and he kept it under wraps, though. In the years to come, Willis was appointed, of all things, Deputy District U.S. Marshal. This later photo of Marshal Morgan was taken just prior to August of 1889, when his wife delivered twins, a boy and a girl. Unhappily, neither survived past 2 months. In the meantime, Willis was plotting, and in December, he and J.S. Francisco, a Butler attorney, entrained to Kansas City, where Willis was gained a false warrant against Morgan. Back in Butler, Willis and an accomplice went to Morgan's house, pictured here, just south of the Presbyterian Church, 2 blocks south of the charred remains of the Walton Opera House. As Morgan opened the door, responding to Willis's knock, each man fired their revolvers, each being mortally wounded. Both funerals were held the next day. Marshal Morgan's a lengthy procession to the cemetery after an overflow services at the Ohio Street Methodist Church, and Willis had services at his own home and then was buried in Oak Hill Cemetery. After the Opera House fire in 1889, it was rebuilt by the Bonham brothers of Kansas City, and they, like the Waltons, had only top-notch entertainment. For years, Butler had tried to get a railroad to come but to no avail. In fact, in 1872, Mount Pleasant Township got involved with a money-losing scheme with the railroad. And just so happens, so did the county of Cass to the north of us. Involved in that was the Cass County presiding judge, mayor pro tem, and an attorney. They were caught with the securities and the money over by Gun City, taken off a train and shot to death, and the money was recovered. Butler and Mount Pleasant was never recovered. Now this is the first depot on the west side of the Missouri Pacific tracks, with the water tower close by. In 1891, two freight trains in the wee hours of the morning collided right in front of Butler's depot. Notice the row of hotels and restaurants on the left side, which would be the east side of the tracks. This is a side view of the wreck showing the force of the collision. There were some injuries, but they weren't dangerous. It was reported that both engines had to be junked, as well as some of the freight cars. This is another view showing the terrific damage to the freight trains in their collision. Note the dressed-up couple strolling along the wreckage. After all, it was a nice, bright, sunny Sunday morning. Bates County's jail, built about the same time as the courthouse, was gaining quite a reputation as a sieve. Prisoners were kicking out the walls with regularity. The sheriff couldn't keep them in, and it was torn down later in 1894. With the jail needed replacing, why not the courthouse? After all, the same grand jury that had condemned the jail now condemned the courthouse as well as the county farm. In December of 1900, it was sold at auction for $500 to J.S. Francisco, the same man who had helped J.W. Willis get a false warrant against Marshall Morgan in 1889. This photo was taken the day of the sale. This photo was taken in January of 1901 as the old courthouse was being dismantled. Notice the timbers on the courthouse lawn and the ice on the trees and the wires, and weren't there a lot of wires back then? And the Palace Hotel iron porch to the right above the American Clothing House. In the early 1900s, baseball was popular just like it is today. This scene also shows the west portion of the south side of the square. Van Hall had a soda pop bottling plant on North Main, and he sponsored this team. The man in the white shirt and tie was Frank Mabbitt, fire chief, and he operated the Opera House Saloon shown at the far right. The man with the bow tie is Jay Gordonier, owner and operator of the Southside Barbershop just behind him. Left to right in front is Arthur Mock, Lloyd Long, Frank Trone, Mr. Caulfield, and Alan Cooper. In the back row, left to right, is Harley Smith, Butch Barker, Mabbitt, Gardenier, Walker Cannon, a Butler banker, and Dusty Miller. Butler was proud of its fire department, and the chief sitting in the center is Frank Mabbitt, yes, the same one who managed the ball team and owned the Opera House Saloon. Notice the equipment that they had. Paul Benish, Butler cigar manufacturer, liked this photograph so well that he named some cigars the Pride of Butler and had this picture on the inside lid of the cigar boxes. Archibald Fisk was the leader of the Butler Silver Cornet Band. He was an ancestor of Charlie Fisk Sr., orchestra leader and theater owner in Butler, and Charlie Fisk Jr., dance band leader in the 1940s and 50s. This is Mr. Fisk's band, all decked out for any and all occasions, and they played for political rallies, socials, fairs, school functions, and even funerals. Noah Bunk McGinnis of the Rich Hill area went to Oklahoma Territory to work on a ranch. When he finally returned, he had some pretty wild ways about himself. In early 1900, he murdered a Mr. Bresherding, a farmer near Pleasant Gap. No reason given. This invitation was received by my grandfather, Pete Herrman of Culver, Justice of Peace of Shawnee Township. Even with the invitation only, some scaled the 14-foot wooden walls to see the spectacle. In the background, you can see part of the east side of the square. McGinnis is shown at the rear of the scaffold at the jail with the rope around his neck as the minister prays. Sheriff E.C. Mudd resigned after this hanging. As some peer in closer to get a better look, Noah Bunk McGinnis' lifeless body swings beneath the scaffold at the north side of the old jail, now the Museum of Pioneer History. October the 10th, 1901, the new courthouse was taking shape as the cornerstone was being placed involving the Masonic Lodge and others. It was a great ceremony and everyone attended agreed it would be a magnificent building. To commemorate the completion of the new courthouse in Butler, several of the merchants around town had special objects depicting the courthouse on it made. The one on the left is a ceramic pin tray with the courthouse on there, and it was put out by the Bazaar racket store here in Butler. And the other is a custard glass or lemon glass cup depicting the courthouse, and it doesn't have any indication who made that. The courthouse is complete, and isn't it a beauty? This was taken during a trial for murderer Dr. Gartrell in 1903. Note the light poles and the light hanging across the street at the right. This is the same photograph, except it's been sent to Germany for coloring and applied to a postcard. And notice the poles are gone and the light is gone. Boy, those Germans were sneaky, weren't they? Courageously, this photographer mounted the dome of the new courthouse for this panoramic view of North Butler. In the left foreground is the People's Bank, and then right over it is the Baptist Church, and then the new hotel building. And then the Methodist Church South is just north of the hotel building. The north side of the square, the white building in the rear, to the back of the north side of the square was the Christian church. This is the east end of the north side of the square, showing the Palace Hotel, big building there. The keyhole-shaped window on the second floor right next to the Palace Hotel is a building that's been occupied by druggists down through the years. And the upstairs was always occupied by photographers for years and years and years. You'll notice a smokestack right above the Palace Hotel. That was from the Butler light plant. And then smokestacks at the very extreme right were from Carpenter and Schaefer ice plant. This is another view of the courthouse with a seldom seen peak at the south side of the square, We're looking south down the sidewalk of the east side of the square. You'll notice that there's a building now on the east end of the south side of the square. There was none at this time. This is Mr. William E. Walton's Butler National Bank, rechartered as the Missouri State Bank in the 1890s. And the German artists were helping again by drawing cobblestones into the otherwise dusty square. This business went defunct in 1930, and then later it was the Butler State Bank, the Charter Bank, Boatman's Bank, and now Nations Bank. This photograph was taken the same day as the photograph of the courthouse during the trial of Dr. Gartrell. It's looking west on Ohio Street on the north side of the square with the Palace Hotel in prominence at the right. This is the east side of the square looking south. And that's the Farmers Bank that burned out during the 1889 fire at the Opera House at the other corner. And, oh yes, the German artist again drew cobblestones in Butler's dusty streets. Dr. Gartrell's trial and murder conviction meant there was going to be a hanging. And a professional hangman was brought in. He's the hatless gentleman to the left center, right under the TL of the Butler sign. The scaffold for the hanging was erected on the north side of the Bates County Jail, now the Museum of Pioneer History. It's strange how something so bland and unassuming can be so deadly to a guilty person. Prior to 1903, Dr. Gartrell had murdered a man named Dunnigan, a horse trader from Kansas City, and neither of the gentlemen were from the Butler area. This pictures Gartrell with the white beard as he looks on as the minister prays. The last legal hanging in Bates County is done as the spectators and officials look on as Dr. Gartrell's body swings beneath the scaffold. This is Radford's Elkhorn Livery Stable, west of the north end of the west side of the square on Ohio Street. Lewis Radford and Sons were horse traders, and they provided horses to the Army during World War I. The upstairs was used for drills of Butler's militia and state guard. He had purchased this from the J.W. Willis estate. Thomas W. Legg was a premier buggy and carriage maker on Lyon Street, back of the square's east side. All vehicles were made to order. This is the bookkeeping department of the Thomas Legg Carriage and Buggy Company, and that's Mr. Legg on the left in front of the window. Three chairs, no waiting, at the South Side Barber Shop, with, front to back, Clarence, Jim, and J. Gordon Nair, the owner and operator, and of course Bertie White, expert shoeshine man. This shop is still operating. Butler has had its share of tragedies, and this one took place in 1906 when U.S. Congressman David D. Herrman and his grandson Waddy died in a fire that consumed the D. Herrman home at 308-310 North Delaware Street. This is a different view of the east side of the square, this one looking north. The prominent corner store is Gench Brothers General Store. In the middle of the square of the side is a white banner saying One Price Shoe Store. And note the object above the light hanging in the middle of the street. This goes back to gaslight days, and that was a pulley up above the light that was used to raise and lower the gas lamps so they could be lit and filled. It was used later when needed to change light bulbs. Here's an interesting view from the courthouse dome, looking southwest at the rebuilt Opera House building with the Laclede Hotel to the right of it. At the south end of the west side is T.L. Petty's grocery store, and on the second floor of that store was the telephone office and switchboards. Note the snow in the sparse building southwest of the square. At Lion Street at Chestnut, the Carpenter Schaefer Ice and Produce House. It was originally the Home Produce. Later it was the Letton Ice Cream Plant and the Ingram Ice and Cold Storage, and presently it's Berry Ice and Randolph's Bindery. Only it's the Home Produce Company, dealing in ice cream, ice, and home produce, and they bought eggs, hides, furs, and wool. And the east part of this building no longer stands. Farmers brought their grain to the elevators in Butler near the railroad, and they usually had time to catch up on all the gossip. The elevator we saw in the previous photograph was paid for by subscriptions when people bought stock in the elevator company. In January of 1907, Oscar Heinlein, who managed the Heinlein part of the Bennett Wheeler Mercantile Company and is also the uncle of author Robert Heinlein, purchased some stock for the People's Elevator. November the 7th, 1908, photographer Liddell caught the Bates County Confederate veterans posed on the east steps of the courthouse. This is Charlie Fisk Sr. and his cornet band, descendant of Archibald Fisk and his silver cornet band around the turn of the century. All were Butler businessmen. Charlie is at the extreme right. Although not a two-train crash, in 1909 this locomotive jumped the track just south of Butler. A couple of crew members were injured, but notice how they spell wreck at the bottom. In an elevator, if you bought shares in the Bates County Fair Association, you helped keep the fair going, and they do that even today. This was the racetrack at the Butler Fairgrounds east of Butler, north of the present Recreation Lake. We're looking north, and this happened about 1912, and my father said he saw his first airplane light and take off on the infield of this racetrack. It lit fine, but to take off, they backed it up against the south end, tied a rope around the tail and to the fence, and the pilot revved up the engine, and at a certain time they cut the rope with an axe, and he took off and just barely cleared the trees. These are some of the behind-the-scenes activities at the Butler Fairgrounds, and it was a big deal for a lot of people in this county, and pilots today say that the racetrack oval is still evident from the air. This was the official race program for the Butler Fair in 1913. It's interesting, the advertisements on there in 1913, Buick was advertising, but the Day and Night Garage, W.H. Hupp and Son were the painters on North Delaware Street. Troy Laundry was on West Dakota. But look at the top, Ketchum and Skinham Land Company. I've known some people like that. This is a 1907 insurance agent map of Butler. This is the south side of the square. And left to right there was a saloon, billiard hall, barber, lunch counter, second-hand store, racket store, 2 or 3 storage buildings and lodge hall upstairs, and a harness shop, and a printing and a tin shop. And there were no buildings on the east side of the square, as we saw in the picture a few minutes ago. Across the street to the right was the Cease Meat Company, and the bowling and billiard parlor. And the light blue, like by the Delaware word, it was the blacksmith and the wagon shop. This is the east side of the square, and then that 1907 insurance map. It gives the heights of the walls, the construction of the building, the types of fuel for heating and lighting, and if they had metal ceilings, that was noted. Beginning at the bottom was a hotel upstairs, and then downstairs was a jeweler and print shop and restaurant and bakery, and then up toward the top end was Levy store, and then across to the north, above Ohio Street, was the Bennett Wheeler Hardware and Farm Supplies and Furniture, and to the east was Brown's Feed Yard, along with Loban Moore Lumber Company. This is North Main, well, at least the east side of North Main, north of the square. And you'll notice that this is the City Hall, the fire department, and the jail in the rear. And that building's still standing. And then there's Produce House up on East Pine and Main Street, with the Butler Municipal Electric Light Plant just right behind. And then on Lion Street was Carpenter and Schaefer, and they also had a building over which would be the parking lot for the City Hall. This is the west side of the square and the northwest corner of the square. Notice the Hotel Pinnell, the Baptist Church, and Day's Monument and Sally's Junkyard. Then behind, to the west of the west side of the square, was Radford's Livery Stable. And notice the courthouse. This is part of the courthouse lawn. And the bandstand, back in 1907, was where the Doughboy statue stands in the northwest corner of the courthouse lawn. The north side of the square, and then Chestnut Street behind it, we notice the Hotel Pinnell again, the Methodist Church South, which is right north of it where the telephone office is now, and then the old Christian Church to the north of the square. And there was a livery stable right behind the bank on Chestnut Street. Education has always been in the foreground in Butler activities, and these were the 3 ward schools, Franklin, Webster, and the high school or Washington School. The Webster School was on Mill Street, and we all know the present grounds as North Field, as it was used for PE classes when the high school was made at Pine and Havana. The Franklin School was on Fort Scott Street at Wells Street, and now the location of Church of Christ. The Washington School was both a grade school and also the high school until 1912. The present grade school sits on the location, having been built in 1939. Needing more space for higher learning, this was the groundbreaking ceremony for the new high school at Pine and Havana Streets. In this photograph, Cora Norton, George Galladay, Ruth Whaling, Herbert Wiemott, and others take part. Completed in 1912, the high school later added more classrooms and a gymnasium. It was a fine building and still stands. Keep your eye on the pole with the street sign at the right center. Same time, same place, but look at that pole that was there in the right center. Now it just goes up to the street sign. Strange. Same building, same place, same street sign, but the pole is completely gone. So I guess the sign, according to the German artist that put the color on this and erased the pole, says that street signs can just hang in midair. Just like when they completed the courthouse, when they completed the new high school in 1912, various businesses, including the Bazaar store and Tackett's Big Racket store in Butler, made commemorative items for the high school. This is a little round pin tray. They also made some in the shape of a cup, and I have one in the shape of a Dutch shoe. In 1912, the high school was built. Butler's new brick depot was completed on the east side of the railroad tracks across from the old depot. Butler has always been blessed with lots of churches. This photo is of one of the first church buildings in Butler. It was the Presbyterian Church on the southwest corner of South Delaware and Fort Scott Street. Here are some of the other early churches: the Presbyterian Church, Christian Church, and then at the bottom the Baptist, the Methodist Church, and the Methodist Church South. In the early 1900s, a permanent tabernacle building was constructed on North Main Street between Pine and Harrison Streets on the east side. The two tall smokestacks were from the City Light plant at Pine and Lyon, and the smaller stacks from the Carpenter and Schaefer ice plant at Lyon and Chestnut. At the top is the Old Catholic Church, which was up by the grade school, and the East Pine Methodist Church at the bottom. The original Baptist Church was located west of the new hotel, and Day's Monument Company and Sally's Junkyard were to the west of the church, and they sold this in 1916 to the government for the post office. When the Baptists sold their property to the government for a post office, they built this church in the northwest corner of Pine and Delaware. It was the former site of the mansion of William E. Walton of Opera House and bank fame. Speaking of banks, this one was on the north end of the west side of the square. Originally it was the Bates County National Bank, and then it evolved into the People's Bank. This is the old Palace Hotel building. On the ground floor was the American Clothing House, later Byram's, then the J.C. Penney store. On the second floor was the hotel and later offices. Third floor was the Elks Hall, meeting room, dance hall. And the second building to the left there, that red building, has always been a drugstore. And in the 1920s, C.C. Rhodes drugstore also had a radio station in with his pharmacy. And it lasted for about 2 years, and it was called WNAR. Ironically, we never are ready, because he had a habit of just switching it on and playing music, or somebody walked in with a mandolin and said, I want to play on the radio. He'd throw the switch and let him play. And anyway, it's ironic though, he died the same year, 1962, that Bill Thornton put KMAM on the air in Butler. If you'll remember, Walton's Missouri State Bank was a red brick building with the door on the corner. Well, he remodeled this in the early 1900s, and it now boasted of granite columns in the front. This is during a street fair in the 20s with the old Farmers Bank building in the background. This was after the paving of the square, and they always covered the brick with sawdust so animals being shown at the fair wouldn't slip. Not to be outdone by the Missouri State Bank's facelift, the Farmers Bank completely tore down their building in 1920, and this is how they got the granite from the railroad depot to the building site, by horses and trailers. Along with the Baptist Church, Tom Day sold his monument shop site to the government for the new post office. Then he moved over on North Main Street, across the street north from the fire station. Off of the grounds, the work began on the new post office, and we're looking toward the northeast here. Well, the post office is taking shape and the framing is being put up. The roofing has been completed on the new post office, the brickwork is done, and only the finish work is yet to be done. Completed in 1918, the post office is basically still the same, solid as a rock, and has had some addition to the rear of the building. Across the street west of the new post office was this stable operated by Harley Smith. You've heard of boardwalks? Well, there's mud in the street, a bank on the left, hotel on the right, and a bank ahead of you, and the boardwalks keep you out of the mud. By now we know what the outside of the store buildings look like, so let's look inside. Here's T.L. Petty's grocery on the south end of the west side of the square. No mouse problems because the cat slept in the basket of food and vegetables. And remember, the telephone switchboard was upstairs. The bazaar store had hankies and tinware for sale as well as other dry goods, but they must have not sold razors. This is located on the south side where the pool hall used to be. This is the lobby of Mr. Walton's Missouri State Bank. This went defunct during the Depression in 1930. During World War II, the Henry family constructed crystals for walkie-talkies for the armed services. Then in 1945, the then former Farmers Bank of Foster moved to Butler, and it became the Butler State Bank, then Charter Bank, then Boatswain's Bank, now Nations Bank. And these columns and the floor tile are still there, only covered with paneling and carpet. In the early 1900s, Chautauquas was quite a thing. They were touring groups of artists, musicians, actors, and they put on usually a 6-day show at each town, and for $2 for an adult season pass, you could take in all 12 shows of this Chautauqua in Butler in 1917. The next four scenes are from an original 33-inch long photo of the immense crowd attending the Soldiers and Sailors Day in May of 1919, from the east side of the courthouse to the east side square. You can see what an immense crowd there was. The courthouse lawn was completely filled with people that were going to get their picture taken, and this was by a new process. This was a 33-inch wide picture, and they didn't have wide-angle lens in, so they had lens on a swivel. They started at one end and just slowly moved that, and nobody was supposed to move. East side of the crowd, and that post was from the bandstand from where they took the photograph. This is the program for Soldiers and Sailors Day that you have just seen, the three photos showing the immense crowd. They had all these things to enjoy. The aerial exhibition over the crowd, and the welcome address by Eddie Herrman. Even a baseball game versus Rich Hill. And then the cantata. And then the dinner for the soldiers. And the minstrel show. And then music, a solo by Herbert Weimott. And then a dance on the pavement in front of the headquarters. Picture show, free for all at Fisk Opera House. And there at the bottom it tells you where everything takes place. Let's look at some street scenes from Butler. First is looking west on Ohio Street. That's the Ohio Street Methodist Church on the left, and then the parsonage, and then the Wyatt, later Jones Hunt, and later the Butler Lumber Company. And on the right is the livery stable. You can see the sign, but you can't see the livery stable. This is on North Delaware Street. On the left is, on the corner there, is the William Walton Mansion, the light-colored house, and then next to it is the Freeman Walton House. This is Pine in Delaware. This is a scene looking north on High Street, just north of Ohio Street. These are some houses on West Ohio Street up near the grade school. This was the Inn Hotel before 1916. Looks like have a group of roadsters there. I'd like to have one of those roadsters now. They'd be worth a lot of money. Like the courthouse and the high school, when they completed the new hotel on the northwest corner of the square of Butler, why they put out some objects that denoted this. This is a cream picture and has a picture of the hotel on it. This is a scene of the east side of the square, taken about the same time as the one we showed of the hotel that had all the roadsters around it, and evidently one of them migrated over to in front of the Farmers Bank. Signs of changing times when harness shops begin to sell automotive tires and oil, Weimott and Majors in the middle of the south side of the square, and they're getting ready to put in a new sidewalk. This is down North Main along the west side, and some of these houses are still standing. In the early 1900s, when rural pupils graduated from the 8th grade of rural schools, they had to come to Butler to be tested and receive their diplomas. This scene was on the east side of the courthouse, taken in April of 1914. This photo was taken at the 11th Bates County Old Settlers Reunion of all present who had resided in Bates County previous to 1860. Pardon me. This is the Butler High School freshman class of 1915. Kneeling, second from the right, is Sam Kersey. On the second row, left to right, is Norma Kersey, Erlene Ellis. I don't know who the third one is. The fourth girl is Madge Ray, and the fifth girl is Mary Decker, later became Mrs. Carl Herrman, my mother. This is the 1915 Butler High School girls basketball team. The school had no gymnasium, so they played in the basement of the Methodist Church South, north of the hotel. This is the 1911, 12, and 13 Butler High School boys championship basketball team. The third and fourth from the left are Hups, Fred and Joe, and on the other end is Bruce Black and Elmer Campbell, and holding the ball is Kenneth Kraft. This is inside the grocery department of the Bennett Wheeler Mercantile Company on the northeast corner of the square. You see some customers and workers there, and you see lots of things on the shelf, hanging from strings or ropes from the ceiling, in boxes and barrels and baskets on the floor. And I guess the cat slept in one of those baskets to keep the mice away. In all growing communities, fraternal lodges played a great part in everyday life. Pictured is but one of the lodges that worked for and in the community of Butler. This is the Knights and Ladies Security Lodge Drill Team. Butler Right Captain J.P. Arnold, age 23, died in action in France in the First World War, June the 4th, 1918. He was originally buried in France, but at the urging of his grandmother, Mrs. J.P. Edwards, his body was exhumed and brought to America. And in 1921, the case on burying his body entered Oak Hill Cemetery, east of Butler. Following Captain Arnold's casket was a squad of soldiers to give him the proper military burial. Since time began, the young men fight old men's wars. The Butler American Legion Post, number 46, was named after Captain Arnold. This is a real good look at the west side of the square. And note the traffic sign in the middle of the street that says "Keep to Right." About halfway down is the West Side Restaurant. This is during a street fair in the 20s on the south side of the square. Above the large hog on the left is the Republican Press newspaper office, and to the left of the man in the dark suit is the Butler Weekly Times newspaper office. We're looking east at the new Farmers Bank building on the right and the Bennett Wheeler building on the left, and the Logan Moore building right straight ahead of us, and this is more of a Butler street fair. Here of Butler was put out by the big racket store in Butler, Missouri, and a lot of stores, when you paid your bill at the end of the month, or if you paid cash when you bought the articles, if the price was enough, they would give you some sort of memento like this. This plate was put out by Bennett Wheeler Mercantile Company on the northeast side of the square. It's a calendar plate, and on the side of the airplane it says 1913. It's a very colorful with the gold trim. J.E. Williams had a grocery store on the north side of the square, and he also put out a 1909 calendar plate. And this is very pretty. That flower in the middle is extremely pretty. This plate was compliments of Norfleet and Ream on the west side of the square in 1911. And notice the bathing beauty in the middle. This is a very pretty plate. This plate also was put out by Norfleet and Ream in 1911. It's a little more racier than the one in blue because you can see this lady's knee, and back then that was pretty risque. I'm going to close with an interior scene of Levy's. From the left is Leela Short, Mrs. Bill Turpin, Mrs. Isom, Mrs. Ray Robinson, Herbert Weemont, Bill Stanley, Mabel Ward Mooney, Mattie Thornbrew, and Maud Fisher in the office. It's been my pleasure to present this to you, and I wish to thank Cheryl Wicks Compton for doing the taping for me. And part of the proceeds after expenses will go of this selling this video will go to the Bates County Museum of Natural History. And if there's good response, why, I just might make part 2 of Butler from the 1920s up to present time. And if response is good than that, why, I'd like to make one of all of Bates County, hitting all of the communities in the county. So I thank you for watching. Good night.